The courtroom fell silent when a tiny girl pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside holding a thin, worn file in her trembling hands. Everyone sitting inside slowly turned their heads toward her because no one expected a child to walk alone into a place where serious crimes were judged. The guards near the entrance looked confused. One of them took a step forward, ready to guide her back outside, but something in the girl's determined face made him pause. She kept walking slowly across the polished wooden floor, her small footsteps echoing softly in the large, quiet room. People began whispering to each other, wondering whose child she was and why she looked so serious. Finally, she stopped in the center of the courtroom, lifted her eyes toward the judge, and said, "Your Honor, I am here to defend my father." The words floated across the silent room. Like a sudden shock, for a moment, no one moved. Some people thought they had heard wrong, while others stared at her with disbelief. The judge, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his glasses carefully. "Young girl, this is a courtroom," he said in a calm but puzzled voice. "You should not be here. Where are your parents?" The girl held the file closer to her chest and answered quietly, "My name is Rayana Miller, and the man you brought here today is my father." At that exact moment, the side door opened and two officers escorted a tall, tired-looking man in handcuffs into the courtroom. His clothes were simple and his face carried the heavy lines of sleepless nights. When he lifted his head and saw the small figure standing in the middle of the room, his heart nearly stopped. "Rayana, what are you doing here?" he said with sudden fear in his voice. The officers guided him toward the defendant's stand, but his eyes never left his daughter. Rayana looked back at him, her eyes shining with tears, yet her voice stayed brave. "It's okay, Dad. I am here." The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, because the name Miller was already written clearly on the board beside the judge. David Miller, accused of the murder of businessman Jonathan Reed. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Victor Hargrove, slowly stood up from his chair, clearly annoyed. "Your Honor," he said, "this is highly irregular. This man is accused of a very serious crime. The courtroom is not a place for children." The judge raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Mr. Hargrove, sit down for a moment," he said. Then he looked back at Rayana again. "Child, do you understand what your father is accused of?" Rayana nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. They say he killed Mr. Jonathan Reed, but my father would never hurt anyone. He is the kindest person I know." David Miller lowered his head, feeling a deep ache in his chest. He never wanted his daughter to see him standing in a place like this. The judge studied the girl carefully. There was something unusual about the way she spoke. Not childish, not confused, but calm and determined. "Rayana," the judge said gently, "the law requires a trained lawyer to represent a defendant. You cannot defend your father officially, but if you believe you know something important, the court will allow you to speak." Rayana took a slow breath, then opened the worn file she had brought with her. Inside were folded papers, a small photograph, and a few handwritten notes. "Before I say anything," she said softly, "I want everyone here to know who my father really is." She turned slightly, pointing toward the man behind the wooden railing. "That is David Miller. He owns a small car repair shop on Maple Street. Every morning he wakes up before the sun rises and works all day, fixing cars so he can take care of me. After my mother died 3 years ago, he became both my father and my mother. He cooks dinner, he helps me with my homework, and when I have nightmares, he stays beside my bed until I fall asleep." The courtroom grew quieter with every word. Many people who had entered the room expecting to see a criminal now looked at the tired mechanic with different eyes, but the prosecutor quickly interrupted. "Emotional stories do not erase evidence, Your Honor," he said firmly. "The police discovered the defendant's fingerprints inside Jonathan Reed's office, and security footage shows him entering the building the night Mr. Reed was murdered." Rayana listened quietly while he spoke. Then she reached into her file and slowly pulled out a photograph. "Maybe the evidence is not telling the whole story," she said softly. The judge leaned forward again. "What do you mean, Rayana?" She walked closer and placed the photograph on the judge's desk. "Because my father was not the only one in that building that night." The judge looked down carefully at the picture. His expression, slowly changing, the photograph showed the entrance of a large office building taken from a security camera. The timestamp Read 11:43 at night. Beside the familiar figure of David Miller, another shadowy figure stood near the door. Someone whose face could not be clearly seen, but whose presence raised many questions. "Where did you get this?" the judge asked Rayana. Answered quietly, "My father fixed the security system for that building last year. The manager knows him well, and when he heard my father was arrested, he showed me the camera recordings." The prosecutor stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. A child bringing random pictures cannot change the facts." Rayana turned to face him, her small hands shaking, but her voice steady. "Then why did the police never mention the second person in the video?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. The judge slowly looked toward the prosecutor, waiting for an answer. Victor Hargrove hesitated for the first time since the trial began. "That figure cannot be identified," he said. "Finally, it could be anyone." "Exactly." Rayana replied softly, "It could be anyone, including the real killer." A quiet wave of surprise passed through the audience. The judge leaned back. "Thinking carefully, Mr. Hargrove, it appears there may be additional details that require investigation," he said. "We will examine this evidence more closely." David Miller looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and fear. He knew she was trying to save him, but he also knew how dangerous the truth could be because the night Jonathan Reed died, David Miller had seen something powerful people in the city would do anything to keep hidden, and now, without realizing it, his little daughter had stepped directly into the middle of that secret. The courtroom remained unusually quiet after Rayana placed the photograph on the judge's desk because the small piece of evidence had created a question no one in the room had expected. The judge studied the picture again while the prosecutor stood stiffly, trying to maintain control of the situation. David Miller watched his daughter with mixed emotions, pride, fear, and deep worry because he knew this path could become dangerous. Rayana stood still in the middle of the courtroom, holding the worn file close to her chest like a shield against the world. The judge finally lifted his eyes and looked toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Hargrove, the presence of another person near the building entrance on the night of the incident raises an important question. Why was this not presented earlier?" Victor Hargrove cleared his throat and replied calmly, "Your Honor, the police investigated all possible angles. The shadowy figure seen in the footage could not be identified, therefore it was considered irrelevant to the case." Rayana quietly stepped forward again. "But maybe it was not irrelevant," she said. "Maybe it was the most important thing everyone ignored." Some people in the courtroom exchanged curious looks because the courage of the little girl was becoming impossible to ignore. The judge nodded slightly as if inviting her to continue. Rayana opened her file again and slowly removed another folded paper. "Before my father was arrested," she began, "he told me something strange happened. The night Mr. Reed died, he was not supposed to be there that late, but someone called the repair shop asking for help with the office building elevator system." The prosecutor quickly interrupted. "That statement has already been recorded. The defendant claims he received a service request, but there is no official record of that call." "Exactly." Rayana replied softly, "There is no official record because the call was made from a private number." David Miller felt a sudden chill run through his body. Hearing his daughter repeat the memory he had shared with her, the judge leaned forward again, his interest clearly growing. "Go on, Rayana," he said. Rayana nodded and continued. "That night, my father closed his repair shop earlier than usual because the caller sounded very urgent. He said the elevator had stopped working and someone was trapped inside when my father arrived. The building looked almost empty. The lights were dim and the security guard was not at the front desk." The courtroom listened carefully as the small girl described the scene, her voice quiet but steady. "My father went to the elevator control room and started checking the system. He found that nothing was actually broken. Someone had simply turned off the power switch while he was trying to understand what happened. He heard a loud argument coming from Mr. Reed's office upstairs." The prosecutor frowned slightly but said nothing. Rayana continued, "My father became worried because the voices sounded angry. He went upstairs to see if someone needed help, but when he reached the hallway, he heard a loud crash and then silence. David Miller closed his eyes, remembering the terrible moment the hallway was dark and the office door was half open, Rayana said. Softly, when my father looked inside, he saw Mr. Reed lying on the floor and another man standing beside him. The room filled. With whispers, again the judge raised his hand for silence. "Did your father recognize that man?" he asked. Rayana shook her head. Slowly, he said, the man turned around quickly and ran out through the back stairs before my father could see his face clearly. David Miller finally lifted his head and spoke in a tired voice. "It's true, Your Honor, I was scared when I saw Mr. Reed on the floor. I tried to help him, but then I heard footsteps outside and realized someone might think I was responsible, so I panicked and left the building." The prosecutor stepped forward, again seizing the moment so the defendant admits fleeing the scene of a murder. "Your Honor, that behavior alone strongly suggests guilt." Rayana quickly shook her head. "No, it suggests fear," she said. "If you walked into a room and suddenly saw a dead body, you might panic too, especially if someone else had just run away." The judge rested his hands together thoughtfully. The courtroom air felt heavier. "Now, because the story was slowly changing shape, what happened after you left the building?" the judge asked. David Miller answered quietly, "I drove home. I barely slept that night, and the next morning the police came to arrest me. They said my fingerprints were everywhere, and the security cameras showed me entering the building." Rayana looked toward the judge again. "Your Honor, my father did go into that building, but he did not kill Mr. Reed. He was called there by someone who wanted him to take the blame." Victor Hargrove crossed his arms skeptically. "That is a serious accusation, young lady. Do you have any proof?" Rayana hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached into the last section of her file. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think I do." The courtroom leaned forward again with sudden curiosity because the determined little girl who had walked into the courtroom alone was clearly not finished yet. And somewhere inside that worn file, she carried something that might change the entire case. The courtroom leaned forward with growing curiosity as Rayana slowly opened the final section of the worn file. Her small fingers carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked older than the others. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, but her eyes stayed focused on the judge because she knew the moment she had been preparing for had finally arrived. The judge watched quietly while the prosecutor, Victor Hargrove, crossed his arms with clear impatience. Rayana placed the paper on the desk and spoke softly. "Your Honor, this is a copy of the phone log from the repair shop where my father works." David Miller lifted his head, slightly surprised because he had not known she had taken the time to find it. Rayana continued, 3 days before my father was arrested, someone called the shop from a private number asking for emergency help at the Reed corporate building. The call lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The person on the phone said the elevator system had stopped working and someone important was trapped inside. The judge studied the paper carefully while the courtroom stayed silent. Victor Hargrove stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, phone records alone prove nothing. Criminals often invent stories to explain why they were present at the scene of a crime." Rayana turned toward him with surprising calm. "Maybe that is true," she said, "but this call was not the only strange thing that happened that night." The judge raised his eyebrows slightly, inviting her to continue. Rayana took a deep breath and spoke again. "When my father arrived at the building, the front desk security guard was missing. His chair was empty and the security monitor was turned off, but the cameras were still recording. That is how this photograph was taken." She pointed toward the image still lying on the desk. The judge looked down again, noticing the second shadowy figure near the entrance. Rayana continued quietly. "The police said that person could not be identified, but I spent hours watching the video over and over again, and I noticed something." The courtroom became even quieter as she spoke, because every person inside felt the tension building. The figure moved differently. She explained he was limping slightly. As he walked, David Miller suddenly looked up, his expression changing as the memory returned to him. "Yes," he whispered. I remember that now. The man who ran past me on the stairs was limping. The prosecutor quickly responded, "Many people have a limp. That does not identify anyone." Rayana nodded slowly. "You are right," she said, "but there is only one person connected to Mr. Reed, who has a permanent injury in his left leg." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Again the judge tapped his gavel for silence and asked, "Who are you talking about?" Rayana looked down at the file again, then slowly spoke the name Thomas Caldwell. The moment the name was spoken, several people in the audience gasped quietly, because Thomas Caldwell was not just any man. He was Jonathan Reed's business partner and one of the most powerful investors in the city. Victor Hargrove's face tightened slightly. "That accusation is outrageous," he said. "Mr. Caldwell reported Mr. Reed's death himself. He is the one who contacted the police." The judge looked thoughtful. "However, Mr. Hargrove, if this claim has even the smallest chance of being relevant, we must consider it." Rayana continued bravely. "My father told me that when he ran out of the building that night, he saw a black car speeding away from the back parking lot. He did not see the driver, but he remembered the license plate started with the letters TC. The prosecutor immediately responded, "Coincidence?" "Your Honor, that means nothing." Rayana shook her head gently. "I thought the same thing at first," she admitted, "until yesterday when I visited the city parking records office." She reached back into the file and produced another sheet of paper. "This is a record of the vehicles registered to Thomas Caldwell. One of them is a black sedan and its license plate begins with the letters TC." The courtroom filled with louder murmurs now, because the pieces of the puzzle were slowly forming a new picture. The judge studied the document carefully while Victor Hargrove tried to maintain his composure. "Mr. Caldwell is a respected businessman," he finally said. "Accusing him of murder requires far stronger proof." Rayana lowered her voice, but her words carried across the silent room. "I know," she said softly, "and that is why I also brought this." She carefully removed a small silver object from the bottom of the file and placed it on the desk. David Miller stared at it with shock because he recognized it instantly. It was a metal cufflink engraved with the letters TC. The judge looked puzzled. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Rayana answered quietly, "My father found it on the office floor beside Mr. Reed that night. He picked it up because he thought it might help explain what happened, but before he could give it to the police, they arrested him and took him away." David Miller nodded slowly, confirming the story. "I kept it in my pocket," he said, "but during the arrest, Rayana must have taken it without me noticing." Rayana looked down, slightly embarrassed but determined. "I hid it because I was scared no one would believe my father if they found it later." Victor Hargrove stepped forward again, clearly shaken but still defiant. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular evidence. That object could belong to anyone." The judge lifted the cufflink closer to his eyes. The engraved letters were clearly visible, TC. The courtroom air felt thick with tension now, because the story that once seemed simple was becoming dangerously complicated. "If this item truly belongs to Mr. Caldwell," the judge said slowly, "then his presence at the scene must be explained." Rayana stood quietly in the center of the room, her small shoulders shaking slightly, but her voice steady. "My father is not the killer," she said. "The real killer is someone who thought he would never be questioned." And now, for the first time since the trial began, the entire courtroom began to wonder if the little girl, standing bravely in the middle of the room, had just opened the door to a truth powerful people had tried desperately to hide. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine law. It felt like the center of a storm, because the name Thomas Caldwell had changed the atmosphere completely. People whispered nervously while reporters in the back rows began writing quickly, trying to capture every word. The judge held the engraved cufflink carefully in his hand, studying the letters TC, as if the small piece of metal carried the weight of the entire case. Victor Hargrove, the prosecutor, forced himself to remain calm, but the confidence he had shown earlier was slowly fading. "Your Honor," he said, "this courtroom cannot simply accuse one of the most respected businessmen in the city based on a child's assumption." The judge looked up slowly. "No one is accusing anyone. Yet, Mr. Hargrove, he replied, but the court has a duty to examine every possible truth. Rayana stood quietly watching the judge because she knew the next few minutes would decide whether anyone would truly listen to her. David Miller gripped the wooden railing in front of him, feeling both pride and fear. His daughter had already done more than any lawyer had done for him, but he also knew that powerful people rarely allowed their secrets to be exposed without a fight. The judge finally placed the cufflink back on the desk and spoke to the court clerk. Contact Mr. Thomas Caldwell immediately, he said. If his name has been raised in connection to this case, the court would like to hear from him. The room filled with surprised murmurs again, because no one had expected the trial to shift so dramatically within an hour. Rayana remained silent, but inside her heart was pounding because she knew if Caldwell appeared, the truth might finally begin to surface. Nearly 30 minutes later, the heavy courtroom doors opened again, and a tall man in an expensive dark suit walked inside. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his confident posture suggested a man used to control. This was Thomas Caldwell. Several people in the audience recognized him immediately. He approached the front calmly, though a slight limp in his left leg was visible with every step. When his eyes moved across the room, they stopped for a brief moment on Rayana, the smallest person in the courtroom yet somehow the one who had summoned him here. The judge spoke firmly. Mr. Caldwell, thank you for arriving so quickly. Your name has been mentioned during this hearing regarding the death of Jonathan Reed. Caldwell gave a polite nod. Of course, Your Honor. Jonathan was my closest business partner. I want the truth about his death as much as anyone else. Victor Hargrove stepped forward immediately, as if to protect the witness. Your Honor. Mr. Caldwell was the one who reported the crime to the police. He has already fully cooperated with the investigation. The judge nodded slightly. That may be true, Mr. Hargrove. However, new questions have emerged. He gestured toward the desk where the cufflink rested. Mr. Caldwell, would you please look at this item and tell the court if it belongs to you? Caldwell walked forward slowly, his polished shoes echoing softly in the silent room. When he reached the desk, he looked down at the cufflink for only a second before speaking calmly. Yes, it appears to be one of mine. I own several pairs with my initials engraved. The courtroom erupted with whispers again, because the confirmation was immediate. Rayana felt her chest tighten, but she forced herself to speak. If it belongs to you, she said quietly, can you explain how it ended up on the floor of Mr. Reed's office? The moment the question left her mouth, the entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Caldwell slowly turned his eyes toward the small girl. His expression remained polite, but there was a faint shadow behind his gaze. Young lady, he said calmly, I visited Jonathan's office earlier that evening. We often worked late discussing company matters. It is entirely possible I lost a cufflink during that meeting. Victor Hargrove quickly added, exactly. Your Honor, there is nothing unusual about that explanation. But Rayana did not look convinced. She took another step forward and spoke again. If you left earlier, then why were you seen near the building entrance close to midnight? Caldwell raised one eyebrow as if amused by the persistence of the child. I was not, he replied simply. Rayana looked toward the judge again, then continued. The security camera shows a man entering the building late that night. The man was limping slightly, just like you. Caldwell gave a small, polite laugh. Many people in this city have injuries, young lady. A limp is hardly proof of anything. The judge leaned forward, watching both of them carefully. Rayana, however, was not finished. She opened the file once more and pulled out a final folded page. This is something I did not understand until last night, she said quietly. The page contained a printed email record. The judge looked at it curiously. What is this? Rayana answered softly. It is a message sent from Mr. Reed's computer 2 hours before he died. The message was never delivered because the internet connection was suddenly shut down, but the draft remains saved in his system. The judge read the first line slowly, his expression immediately turning serious. The courtroom waited in breathless silence while he continued reading. Then he lifted his eyes toward Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, this message appears to be addressed directly to you. Caldwell remained calm, but a brief flicker of tension crossed his face. "What does it say?" the prosecutor asked impatiently. The judge read the line aloud. "Jonathan Reed wrote Thomas, I know what you did with the company funds, and I will expose everything tomorrow morning unless you return the money tonight." The courtroom exploded into shocked whispers because the meaning of the message was unmistakable. Rayana looked toward Caldwell, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Reed was going to reveal that you had been stealing from the company, wasn't he?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Thomas Caldwell did not immediately respond. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything said before. And in that long, quiet moment, everyone in the room began to realize that the truth behind Jonathan Reed's death might be far darker than anyone had imagined. The silence inside the courtroom became so heavy that even the smallest movement sounded loud. The judge's words about the unfinished message from Jonathan Reed still echoed through the room, and every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Thomas Caldwell, the powerful businessman who only minutes earlier had walked in with complete confidence. Caldwell stood very still, his calm expression slowly fading as the weight of the accusation settled over him. Victor Hargrove, the prosecutor, stepped forward, quickly trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is still speculation," he said firmly. "An unfinished message cannot prove murder." The judge did not answer immediately because he was watching Caldwell carefully, waiting for a reaction. Rayana remained in the center of the courtroom, her small hands holding the worn file tightly, but her eyes were fixed on the tall man in the expensive suit. "Mr. Caldwell," she said quietly, "if Mr. Reed was planning to expose you, then you had a reason to silence him." The moment the words left her mouth, a wave of whispers moved across the audience. Caldwell finally spoke, his voice controlled but colder than before. "That is a very serious accusation." "Young lady," he said, "you should be careful with such claims, David." Miller felt his heart racing as he listened, because the direction of the trial was now changing faster than anyone expected. The judge looked again at the printed D&T email. "Message, Mr. Caldwell. Did you meet Jonathan Reed in his office on the night of his death?" he asked. Caldwell hesitated for the briefest moment before answering, "Yes, I did, but I left long before anything happened." Victor Hargrove nodded quickly. "Exactly, Your Honor. My client reported the crime himself, which hardly suggests guilt." Rayana shook her head slowly. "But you did not report it until the next morning," she said softly. "The police records say the call was made at 8:30 in the morning. That means you waited almost 9 hours after Mr. Reed died." The courtroom reacted with another wave of murmurs. Caldwell straightened his shoulders, clearly irritated. "I was in shock," he replied. "I needed time to think." The judge leaned forward, his voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell, did you argue with Mr. Reed about company funds that night?" Caldwell remained silent for a moment too long, and that silence spoke louder than any answer. Finally, he said, "Jonathan misunderstood certain financial decisions. The company was going through a complicated restructuring process." Rayana quietly opened the final page in her file. "I also found something else," she said. The judge looked at her again. "What is it?" Rayana placed the document on the desk. It was a bank statement showing a series of large transfers from the company account into a private investment fund owned by Thomas Caldwell. The dates matched the weeks leading up to Jonathan Reed's death. The judge studied the document slowly, while Victor Hargrove looked increasingly uneasy. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, "these transfers amount to nearly $8 million. Can you explain them?" Caldwell finally lost a portion of his calm. "Those funds were temporary business investments," he replied sharply. "Jonathan knew about them, but the judge interrupted. The message suggests otherwise," he said quietly. "According to this email, Mr. Reed believed you had stolen the money and planned to expose you." The tension in the courtroom reached its highest point now, because the truth was beginning to form piece by piece. David Miller watched in disbelief, realizing that the nightmare destroying his life was finally being understood. Rayana spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "The night my father arrived at the building, he heard you arguing with Mr. Reed. You were afraid he would Reveal everything. The judge turned to Caldwell once more. Did you confront Jonathan Reed about this message? Caldwell clenched his jaw but said nothing, and that silence finally answered the question. The judge slowly nodded as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Security footage shows the defendant, David Miller, entering the building because he was called there to repair an elevator system that had deliberately been disabled. The judge said someone needed him to appear at the scene so he could become the perfect suspect. The courtroom listened in stunned silence while the judge continued. Mr. Caldwell, your cufflink was found in the office. Your vehicle was seen leaving the parking lot, and now we have evidence of a financial motive. Caldwell suddenly slammed his hand on the table. Enough, he shouted. The calm mask he had worn finally shattered. People in the audience gasped as the powerful businessman lost control. You think that message proves anything? He said angrily. Jonathan was going to destroy everything we built. He would have ruined the company, ruined thousands of jobs. I only wanted to scare him, but he refused to listen. Rayana felt a chill run through her body because the confession was already beginning. The judge watched carefully. Are you admitting you were present when Jonathan Reed died? Caldwell breathed heavily, his eyes dark with frustration. Yes. I was there, he said. I argued with him. He threatened to expose me. And in that moment, everything spiraled out of control. He tried to call someone. I grabbed him. We struggled, and he fell, hitting the corner of the desk. His voice grew quieter as the truth finally emerged. I panicked when I realized he was not moving. I turned off the elevator system and called the repair shop so someone else would appear on the cameras later. The courtroom exploded with shocked voices because the full confession had finally arrived. David Miller closed his eyes, overwhelmed by relief, while Rayana stood frozen, realizing the nightmare was ending. The judge struck the gavel, loudly ordering silence. Thomas Caldwell, he said firmly, you are under arrest for the murder of Jonathan Reed and for attempting to frame an innocent man. Officers moved forward immediately, placing handcuffs on the stunned businessman. As he was led away, the tension in the room slowly faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of justice. The judge turned his attention toward David Miller. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the confession, this court finds David Miller not guilty of all charges. The words echoed through the courtroom. Like a powerful wave of relief, David Miller felt tears in his eyes as the guards removed his handcuffs. He stepped forward and knelt down in front of his daughter Rayana. You saved me, he whispered, his voice trembling. Rayana wrapped her arms around him tightly. I told you the truth would win, she said softly. Many people in the courtroom began clapping quietly, moved by the courage of the small girl who had walked into the courtroom. Alone with nothing but determination and love, the judge watched the scene with a faint smile. Sometimes, he said, the bravest voice in a courtroom does not belong to a lawyer but to someone who simply refuses to give up on the truth. And in that moment, everyone understood that the tiny girl named Rayana had done something no one expected. She had faced a powerful lie, uncovered a hidden crime, and brought justice back into the light.